Good evening. My name is Dr. O, and welcome to Health Caring Differently, where we inspire diverse students to explore careers in healthcare. So I really appreciate you tuning in, and I would love you to tune in every Tuesday at 7 p.m. Eastern Time. That's when we do the show, and follow us on all our social media platforms to stay in the loop, gain valuable resources, and hear more about our next stream. So that's how you'll know who we have every week. Also, I encourage you to sign up for our newsletter. So really, these sessions are like inspiration. Like you're going to hear, our next guest and be inspired by her story. But the newsletter is where we give information. And so we give information about diversity pathway programs into medicine, information about scholarships and research opportunities for students. So, please do sign up for the newsletter, which you can find on our website, healthcaringdifferently.com. And, for tonight, please feel free to drop your questions for our guest in the chat during the stream, and I'll make sure to ask them. All right. So today's guest, I'm very excited. I'm always excited when I have a resident on. Residents are so busy and work so hard. So my guest today is Dr. Santanna Hernandez. She is Dene from Lidley Q Nation and Cold Lake First Nation on her father's side and Dutch on her maternal side, currently living in Mohkinstsis on the traditional territories of the Blackfoot peoples. Dr. Hernandez is a rural family medicine resident at the University of Calgary. She serves in a variety of leadership roles. I have seen her, we're going to talk about it tonight, but she serves in a variety of leadership roles, both in and outside of medicine, and walks a parallel path with allies advocating for decolonization and equity for Indigenous communities. Welcome, Dr. Hernandez.
Hello, thank you so much for inviting me, Masicho, for giving space. I'm excited for our conversation and to hopefully inspire some future Indigenous learners or Black learners or people from lower socioeconomic backgrounds to know that they can get into medicine if they want to.
Yes, and they can if they want to, but it's a journey, and we are here to inspire folks. And I find your path very inspirational. Right. To be honest, I had somebody contact me, from the Black community, saying that they were already working as a nurse practitioner, but had it in their heart of thinking about pursuing medicine. And, they weren't sure because they're already a nurse practitioner and, a little thinking about going back to school, like not, directly from undergrad. And I just, I briefly told them about you. I was like, you can do it if that's in your spirit and your heart and you have the talent and the supports in place. But, I have a guest coming up who's just done amazing work and had previously worked as a social worker and had been in a professional position and then decided to change careers. So with all of that, because I just find your path so inspiring, I need to stop yapping and let you talk about that path. So do you want to tell us how you are health caring differently, Dr. Hernandez?
Yeah, you know what? Part of my journey to coming to medicine came from a lot of really negative experiences as an Indigenous woman trying to access care, living in super rural and remote areas in Alberta and British Columbia, where you don't have access to many things. I mean, I had to travel 27 hours to be able to give birth to my third child because they didn't have maternity services, and I couldn't afford to live in a hotel for a month.
You traveled 27 hours. Like you're a mom of 4. You're saying to have your child, you traveled 27 hours.
Yeah, the next hospital that had maternity services was 4 hours away, and I didn't have the financial ability to live in a hotel for a month. So my in-laws lived in the Lower Mainland, so we traveled down to the Lower Mainland from Fort Nelson, which is quite far north, to give birth to our third child because that was what we had to do because we couldn't afford to live in a hotel. So we had to find an option to be able to afford to be gone from our home for 4 weeks, because they make you leave at about 36 weeks in case you go into labor. And I had a history of two-week early postpartum hemorrhaging. So we had to be smart. And that was kind of that safety approach. So that's just one of the many experiences that I had in accessing healthcare on my own. And then I went into social work, and I really focused on health policy and saw so many of the barriers that my patients were facing in the hospital, and try to figure out where was the power to kind of help kind of facilitate better access to care.
Mm-hmm.
And my kid's pediatrician actually was like, you should become a doctor. And at first I thought that man was crazy. I literally was in his office every 2 weeks as like a busy mom with kid with medical stuff going on. I was like, literally, I spend so much time with you. When do you think I'm going to have time to get an undergraduate degree or go back and become a doctor, which you couldn't do in our small town that we lived in. So that meant like relocating my entire family for that process. And we did it, and we've made it so far. But I think back about that experience now, and Dr. Henry Upe, he's actually a pediatrician in Toronto now, but he lived in our really small rural area, and the only Black person in town, and I was one of the few Indigenous people in town, and the irony that it took one of the only Black people in town to encourage me to actually pursue medicine, because I didn't get that kind of same feedback from my teachers or my educators when I was in high school. I was told not to get pregnant before graduating, which I did, but that was about the goal. Nobody asked me what college or university I wanted to attend, or kind of had that goal in mind for me. So it took me a minute. It took the encouragement of my kid's pediatrician thinking that I could do it. British Columbia has this amazing program called Learning Together, and their adult basic education was all free. So I was able to access that program to upgrade my high school courses, because I took no science in high school. And it really was those kind of like systemic investments that was what made it possible. Because if I was in Alberta when that happened, I wouldn't have been able to afford to upgrade to be able to get into university or to apply for scholarships or bursaries, because there's no scholarships or bursaries to upgrade high school courses. And so I was really fortunate to be able to connect to these resources to get my undergraduate degree, to have support from the Okanagan Nation for part of my undergraduate degree, and then to continue to find these mentors to kind of help manage that pathway, because nobody in my family went to university. So I didn't really have those people in my own home or my family to ask what that looked like. Yep. And then you got into med school, and then you move your family, you figure it out, and do it during a global pandemic, and it just adds a little spice to the journey.
Lord. No, that is, there's some things I call like a beautiful nightmare, because like, given the horrible experiences that you had in the healthcare system, given the fact that, I mean, it's telling that you said that in high school, they said to you, don't get pregnant. Like, that was the big goal, don't get pregnant in high school. And then you didn't take science classes. So clearly you didn't, you know what I mean? It's not like you were gravitating towards that. And then this doctor saw this, you know what I mean? That spark in you, like his spirit spoke to him, or maybe the ancestors even spoke to him, right? Because it's those moments where like, you don't know why, you know what I mean? The person has to speak that. And you might have actually, I've had situations where somebody says something to me and I'm like irritated, because like you mentioned, you're there with your children. You're like, are you nuts? Like what, how can you, but it was like that is a moment of destiny. And so there's beauty in that. And the fact that you followed that, I think sometimes we have these moments and we're like, you know what, it just doesn't work. But I think it's so beautiful that you followed this path, and the amount of, and you didn't follow it alone, because there's systemic resources, but there's also community and community supports that were in place.
And it's true. And like, you can't do this alone, especially like if you are a mom, or if you are somebody from a marginalized community, because medical school can be very isolating, and you really have to build that village to kind of fill your cup as you navigate what is hard for people with all of the resources. And so if you're not one of those people with all the resources, you have to build that village to kind of help support you and get that through you. I mean, I'm sure you've seen the rates of suicide within medical students and residents. It's quite high, and there's that recent Twitter story that came out about a resident in the U.S. that's been made quite public, and kind of bringing that issue back. But like, having my kids was super protective. There was some really dark days in med school, but I came home and there was always something bigger to live for, right? There was always something. I already did more than anybody ever expected me to do. And at the end of the day, regardless of whatever happened in med school, I had 4 beautiful kids who needed me. I have a husband who needed me. I have amazing friends who need me and want me to be around. And those are the reminders that you need in those really dark and traumatic moments that my medical education experience was.
Yeah. And I mean, we, you know, I are both involved in work that addresses the systemic racism and colonial present, not past, the colonial present of healthcare. And you talk about, yeah, it was important to have, you know, like, it is important to have your village and your family and your friends supporting you. You know, I wonder, do you feel, because I know that you're, along with everything you're describing, you're also taking on a lot of leadership roles. And we're going to talk about the CMA apology in a second. But I know from the community that I come from, and I, you know, I was first in family as well. And, you know, I certainly didn't face the challenges that you described. No. You know, but certainly a number of challenges in my path of medicine, but feeling a sense that I had a responsibility to give back, right? So that's a little bit of the going above and beyond. I'm wondering what, on top of like being a mom and a good friend and daughter and all of your roles, and then doctor, right? Resident doctor, motivates you to take on leadership roles, to speak truth to power, to, you know what I mean? Go above and beyond. What is that? What is the ignition of that fire in you, and how does it stay hot?
I mean, one, ADHD, but like that's what keeps me going for the most part. But it is a superpower. But in all seriousness, my like traditional name that was gifted to me, Daninessa Chotesqui, translate to Eagle Woman, and I was told by Dene elders that part of that is flying high and looking at the terrain and seeing what it is and being that bridge between two worlds. And I think about that a lot, and it's interesting because when I get presented with these incredible opportunities that I've been given throughout my medical education, the relationships that I've been able to build with leaders, the trust I've had when I served as the president of the CFMS, and the trust that
we have CFMSs, sorry.
Oh yeah, sorry, Canadian Federation of Medical Students. So
yes, national leader.
When students from across the country reached out to me and were like, you should run for this, because really at the time I honestly, I was busy. I was in pre-clerkship. It was COVID. And as I'm also in the military, which adds another layer to this kind of whole equation. But one of the things about being a military medical student is that your CARM's life looks a little bit different. So I didn't necessarily need these opportunities to build my CV and put those things at the forefront the way that other people might be working on their CVs to apply to competitive CARM streams, right? I knew I was going in the military stream. There's protected seats for us. It's a very different game that you have to play. So I didn't need it for that. But being trusted to hold those spaces, I think about those teachings that my elders gave me and the responsibility that I feel to honor those gifts that they tell me that are mine to carry from our community. And it's really hard when I sometimes want to say no because I'm tired, to think about like, your elders told you have this role to play and this is your responsibility to us. And so in my mind, sometimes saying no means saying no to this gift that I was given from my community and that I have the responsibility to honor. So it's a little bit a tricky situation, both culturally to navigate and then navigating what that looks like from a work-life balance perspective, making sure I maintain those really great relationships, both with my children and my husband, but also the people who are important to me outside of that circle.
Yes. No, I can imagine. And I mean, life as a resident involves sleep deprivation. So, you know, to whatever extent you can, because I know you're honoring so many people, please find ways to honor yourself. I know people say that, but we need that longevity, especially as mamas, right? And so sometimes it's just in the shower, just taking that moment of meditation or whatever you need to do. Because I can hear it. I mean, that's it. You want to honor the gifts, but you also want to preserve the gifts, right?
Yeah.
So I hope that for you. But I'm still amazed. You know, I only got a personal snippet of witnessing your gifts, right? Because we haven't known each other that long. But I did see it during the CMA, so the Canadian Medical Association apology to Indigenous people and the role. Because I didn't know that you. I knew you when we corresponded. I knew that you had been involved in the process. I didn't know that you're going to speak that day, and just really, I just found it fantastic. It was just phenomenal. But for those who don't know, so our first guest of the season, Dr. Alika Lafontaine, who's past president of the CMA, came out and talked about the Canadian Medical Association issuing an apology to Indigenous people for past and present harms, and that there's, you know, an action plan, not just an apology, to improve outcomes. Do you want to talk about like your experience as a resident leader, as an Indigenous health leader, as somebody who was part of this historic moment?
Yeah, you know what? I'm really proud of how it came together. It was several years of incredible work. The first Indigenous Guiding Circle 3 years ago came up with this with like the leadership of individuals like James Makokis and a few other key leaders in that team who really pushed to have an apology, to have those words, to have something that created accountability, and we wanted to honor that in a good way. So building up the second iteration of what that Indigenous Guiding Circle was, and the stars aligning where you actually have 3 Indigenous board members on the CMA when they historically hadn't really had any, to
Wow.
also help facilitate and guide that leadership. But like Creator put a lot of things together to allow this work to happen in a good way. And the CMA, being a colonial organization, and it acknowledges that,
Mm-hmm.
had to sit in a lot of discomfort as we navigated that process, in helping the elders really guide the work that we were doing, in giving the Indigenous Guiding Circle space to help guide what that looked like, and making sure we had fulsome representation from both First Nations, Inuit, and Métis communities to really help facilitate that no voices were left out. And then starting the day off in ceremony, I think that was something that they hadn't facilitated before. So giving up some of that control and allowing us to help honor those pieces that needed to happen. And then also becoming caretakers of the medicine bundle. There was a beautiful ceremony that happened at the Mungo Martin House where people contributed medicines from all of their different communities from across Turtle Island. And with the elders' direction, the elders wanted that gifted to the CMA to be the caretakers. And with that comes a great responsibility and a lot of learning. So the elders are working with our executive leadership team and our presidents and staff to really have a good understanding about what that responsibility means and how to honor that in a good way. And while uncomfortable, the CMA is embracing it in ways that I'll be honest, at first didn't expect, because it's really hard within these colonial organizations to embrace this work. And seeing how they've done that has been really uplifting, because I've done a lot of work where a lot of these issues have been dismissed.
Mm-hmm.
And then also opening up the resources, because I think when you work in these systemic organizations, their priorities are reflected in what their budget looks like. So really making sure that they took away those barriers for things to happen in the way that they needed to happen, pivoting based on what the elders and the Indigenous stakeholders were saying needed to happen, and just really jumping in feet first. Was it perfect? No. There's things that we're going to continue to learn from. I think there is lots of things we try to mitigate by creating wellness resources for people across the country in partnership with the Indigenous Physicians Association of Canada. They built this beautiful wellness resource guide that helped individuals be safe. We had safe spaces at the facility for those who were there in person, and then online resources for anyone who needed it. But it comes with a lot of trauma and talking about a lot of harms that a lot of people have experienced, myself included. So there was a lot of emotions, and I think it's, like we said, the first step, a catalyst, and a lot of work that needs to be done. And I'm really excited to see how the action plans coming forward, particularly the reviewing the code of ethics from the CMA, because from a medical legal standpoint, we've seen that used against people when they've tried to bring racism forward because it's not explicitly said. So to have that as a tool for people from marginalized backgrounds to use to hold these awful things in our system accountable will be such a game changer from a legal perspective, and creating a safe space in medicine for individuals like us and those who are going to come after us, because the system isn't set up right now to work. So I think, again, we have so much room to go, and the CMA is still motivated, which is great. And I'm happy to be along for the ride as I can and offer support, and then also bring in other voices who can shape it in a different way. And that's really what holding these leadership roles is creating a pathway for those who come after us. So.
No, absolutely. And, so I was in some of the pre and post, like just video sessions to encourage allies around how to support this work and the reconciliation that is happening, now, that needs to happen. But I'm curious on your end, like, you've been so deeply involved, and one of the things I'd spoken to Alika about early on was allyship. First of all, of course, we know it's very important, but I think it's different when you're not a white settler. And I think there are ways in which, and I'm going to speak as a Black person, in which we have to engage in a decolonization process, thinking about how we have benefited from colonization, but also how we are impacted by colonization. It's a whole different thing that has some overlap with a white settler experience, but quite different. And also decentering ourselves, which I learned from Alika as well, right? So I'm Nigerian. I'm not really good at decentering myself. Nigerians will get the joke. We tend to center ourselves, but this was important to kind of stand back and be in solidarity with. But I'm curious, from your perspective, for the CMA apology and beyond, because I'm thinking about our audience now. We've got young folks who are generally of BIPOC backgrounds, and I tend to have a larger Black student population. We're going to get to your questions in a second, but I want students to hear about what your thoughts are on critical allyship for when it comes to being a Black person or a person of color, and walking in solidarity with Indigenous folks here on Turtle Island.
Yeah, you know what? It's really interesting, because I find one of the hardest pieces is there's I'm sure you're aware, the model immigrant, right? Where you come in, you're expected to do X, Y, Z, and then those will be bountiful for you if you follow this recipe and be that model immigrant, which is super important and a valid thing that you've been developed into based on what a lot of immigrant families have to experience when they're coming to Canada. But also, Canada is very politely racist, because when you're outside in the world, you don't hear as much about these negative things that are happening in Canada. And so sometimes also just taking the time to educate yourself on what the issues actually are, because I would say, like, I come from a program that is majority international medical graduates here in my program, and many of them had no idea that these issues were even issues. So it's hard to be an ally for something you know nothing about, for one. It's not a part of externship. It's not a part of your exams when you're looking at citizenship. They touch on it very briefly, and it's a very whitewashed version of what Indigenous history actually is. So I think that's really a key thing for thinking about, like, our Black and other racialized people coming to Canada. And then also some kindness for yourself, because I think a lot of people from, like, South Asia and from Africa are coming because they've been harmed by colonization as well. And then they come here with this dream of what their life can be like. And then to hear that colonization is so rampant and such a hard thing for certain communities here in Canada is a really hard thing for them to kind of mentally shift with. And I saw this a lot with facilitating the blanket exercise, which is an exercise to talk about the history of colonization in Canada, for people who might not know about it. But international students actually are usually the ones that take it the hardest. I find there's international students and then educators are the two populations that have really visceral emotions when participating in that, because it really impacts what they know to be true.
Right.
And then they really have to grasp with that. So I think really taking the time to understand what the issues are, don't be afraid to ask questions, because you're not going to know if you don't ask questions. Ask those questions in a respectful way. And I'd say most people are going to be willing to have that conversation, but then be prepared to put action behind it, because nothing is more infuriating than having somebody ask me these questions, taking on the emotional labor of educating them, and then seeing them continue to be harmful.
Yes.
Right? So those are kind of the key things that you have to be self-aware on, be kind to yourself, be curious, and do better.
Yes. No, I love that, having that curiosity. And for Black people and African peoples, particularly out east, so when we're talking about Nova Scotia, Quebec, and some Ontario, some people have multi-generation ancestry here in Canada, but I think there's still that tension of, you know what I mean, how to walk in solidarity with. So I think a lot of the principles that you just provided, whether somebody is a newcomer, parents are newcomers, or they've been here and their family has been here for centuries, actually, what you've described actually is key, right? Like doing the work, having compassion for self, and being part of change, right? The action.
Yeah.
So thank you for that.
Yeah.
Okay, so we have questions, because I could see the questions. The questions are more about balancing, life as a resident. So I just wanted to get into the allyship piece for you folks, but we're going to dive into the questions. Yursky is on it. So Yursky is here like every Tuesday with the questions. I got you, Yursky. So Yursky is asking, as a mother and resident, how is the family work balance? Do you get much time with your kids, or are you super busy? And I'm going to ask you to answer this question in a special way, because part of it is like residency is a few years and it's pretty intense, but then there's life after residency, right? Because you're talking about a certain part of your training, and then you're going to be done. So what is this? What is the work-life balance? Is there a balance? What is it like for you?
You know what? It's interesting. As a rural family med resident, I think I am privileged to have program directors who are fully invested in my wellness, for one. So we sat down on the first day and she taught me exactly which rotations I could take, which exact days off, to make sure that I could maximize what I was missing. And actually, we're quite encouraged to take that time off, which I think was a huge shift from medical school, because there was a lot of guilt and shame if you even took, like, I remember not getting approved to have an afternoon off to go watch my kids' Christmas concert at their school, but then like saw people vacationing in Hawaii and that was approved. And I was like, oh, okay, I see how it is. And then just opting to have my husband took videos of that one. And then I was able to kind of participate in different ones. So I try to make sure that when I have time off, I volunteer for my kids. It's quite a mind shift, because I actually feel like when I went back to school, it was to kind of figure out who I was outside of being a mom. And then it was kind of like a self-care piece that I did for myself, going back to school and learning. And then now my kids, and doing those things that I think I was not trying to get away from, but trying to figure out what that balance was. And school kind of gave me that. But I'm really actually quite close with all of my kids. I mean, my kids are a little bit older. They're teenagers. So they have...
Tell us how old your kids are.
Yeah. So they're 16, 15, 13, and 11, almost 12. So they're in full teenage puberty, social media. Maybe they're watching it now. Maybe their friends are watching.
Right?
It's hard to say, but I do have quite a close relationship with them. And kids are so tech savvy now that like my kids and their friends are constantly sending me snaps when I'm at work or when I'm away on rotations. So that's kind of one way I stay connected to them. I make sure I volunteer every single time I can so that I get that extra time with them. I try to coordinate to make sure I get to spend birthdays and stuff back in Calgary, because right now I'm in Medicine Hat, which is where my like primary rural family med posting is. So I'll spend about 7 months here over the 2 years doing my training. I have a stay-at-home husband that also is very helpful, who cooks.
Who cooks?
So
Hey, okay.
hate cooking, never been a fan of it. I can bake you amazing cakes, but if you
I
need me
can't
to
even
cook
do
you
that.
like a dinner, I'm like, it's not going to happen. So thankfully, that also helps if you're one of the primary parents who also has to take care of the feeding and the bathing and all of those things. That adds an extra layer of complexity. But again, like build your village. Like one of my best friends in med school, she has taken a break for having a baby at the end of right before clerkship started, and my daughter went and stood outside of her exams babysitting her kids so that she could write her exams. But she was breastfeeding, so it kept her close, and we trade off. My kids go babysit hers, she comes picks them up for appointments, and you just kind of figure out what that balance needs to be. And don't guilt yourself if you're missing that well child visit. Like, your doctor now, you're probably going to recognize if they're off. Don't kind of put that guilt on yourself. Be kind. Steal those moments when you can have them. Those car rides will become amazing, beautiful things that used to drive you crazy. I love that 20 minutes of uninterrupted time with them. Celebrate their performances. My kids are all very active dancers. So my one daughter is a competitive dancer, and the other 3 perform for the Calgary Stampede.
Wow.
So I try to schedule my rotations around when their busy times of year are. So I try to take rotations that aren't as in demand for a call during dance comp season and in July when Stampede starts, because that's kind of a busy mom life. And then find a program that's supportive. Like, ask your programs what their attendance policies are. Ask how they're willing to support. If you're going for one of the specialty ones, I probably wouldn't bring up if you want to have kids, because it's still not safe to do so. And then have those conversations early with the residents who are there, and try to find those champions. The Federation of Medical Women of Canada, they've been a huge support for me in finding electives and for helping connect me with incredible female leaders from across the country, and then are also helping support a project on creating an education plan on family planning and what that can look like in residency, and educating people on maternity benefits and things that you probably wouldn't know to think to ask about, and things that you don't necessarily get in as attending. So trying to bring that information into your family planning timeline, because if you've never had to do it, you just really don't know. So it's really trying to kind of figure out what that looks like. And I know someone's asking, I am a resident in Alberta. So I'm speaking to my experience. I am well connected, so I hear a lot about different programs from across the country. And I think it really depends on your program. I would say I'm really well supported in my rural program. I haven't heard as the same support in like an urban program that they're in, but I've seen great support in like the Edmonton urban program. They've been quite supportive of some of the moms that I know in that program, and trying to figure out what you want to do, because your kids also need a really happy mom. And settling on a residency program because you think it's going to make your life easier now for this short window of time potentially is going to make you resentful for what is a 30, 40 plus year career. So if you ever ask your partner or your kids what they want you to do, I promise they will always tell you to shoot for your dream. And that's a really hard thing. And I'm guilty of this myself, because sometimes I forget to do that. And I don't necessarily give my family the credit that they deserve to have when it comes to supporting me, because when I got offered an opportunity to go to Uganda on elective, my first response was, how am I going to figure that out? It was September. It was back to school. I was like, I don't even think my husband knows how to register for hockey or what school sign-in forms are. I don't even know if he knows how to pay our bills. Like, these were all things that I was like, the administrative burden of teaching him those things was like, nah, I'm just not going to go. And then thankfully I had mentors who kept asking, and happened to ask me one time in front of him, and he's like, you never told me about this. Of course you can go. And figured it out and made it happen. And I wouldn't have had that opportunity if they weren't willing to kind of learn those things and kind of step up and take on that administrative burden and that primary parenting role. And we, I think, are really bad at asking for help. And oftentimes people are kind and are actually willing to help. And we are all such fierce, independent moms that think we can do it all. And we can, but we can also have people who will step up for you. And we're terrible at asking for it when we need it, myself included.
But we need to. And I mean, what I love about what you said is like you're very well resourced in the sense that you look for mentors and opportunities and supporters and organizations. And I think that is a key piece that, you know, everybody, whether you're early in your journey and thinking about medical school, whether you're already in, you know, medical school or residency, whether you are a parent or not a parent, I think it's really, like you said, we have to ask, we have to kind of look for these different resources in the system. We have to look in our friend circle and our partners and look within ourselves and people and say, you know, I need help. Right. And I think I know you say that you're trouble at asking for it, but in fact, I can sense from what you're describing that that you do ask for the help eventually and you do receive it. And that's such a beautiful thing. As you help community, so many people see that light in you and are willing to help you. And I think that is the beauty of why this is important. If you are in thinking about medicine and you don't see people who look like you, it's probably because we need someone who looks like you. We need somebody who's traveled that path that you have traveled, that is less traveled in medicine or in healthcare in general, and to be able to walk that path. You know, as you said, Dr. Hernandez, you cannot do it alone, or you should not ideally do it alone. So it becomes creating family, and family can be people who are related to you or not related to you, right? And having the right friends and supports to be able to have your family. And it's, like you said, it's not always going to be in balance, but you try your best. And it seems like your children and your husband recognize that you're doing that, and they try their best to be understanding and support you. So I think that is beautiful. I just want to also acknowledge, so Yursky, yes, we know you, Deontay's Handcrafts. We answered the question that you asked, which was similar about work-life balance, and also this piece around family residency program in Alberta. And also, I liked what you said, Dr. Hernandez, about really thinking about your needs and asking the questions for the residency program. And it might also be for the medical schools or the cities that you're in, thinking about where the resources are and what the experiences are. I could say for quite a few Black medical residents, especially in family medicine in Ontario, sometimes rural spaces have been quite anti-Black and racist and have been negative experiences. Whereas you're saying in Alberta, rural has been a positive space for you in family medicine. So it really depends on the person. You have to ask the right questions and think about your context and your needs. So I love that you do that.
Yeah, and I think it depends on what you're identifying, what your needs are. So for me, having a little bit more control over what my schedule looked like, being able to maximize my electives in Calgary so I can go home and be with my husband and children because I wasn't going to move them here during high school. Those were priorities for me. So like I know one of my colleagues here in residency who is from Nigeria, she talks about how she's had a positive experience, but again, it's quite isolating because there's not many people who look like her. And it can have that impact. And we've had a huge surplus of Black doctors joining our teams down here at the hospital that I work at, which she commented on and that she could notice. And I think that's a huge thing to recognize, is that just your presence and existing in these spaces really uplifts a lot of people. And I think about the opportunities I've had as an Indigenous woman inspiring people to go back to school, which they never thought they could, or other moms. My husband worked as a truck driver for a long time, and I'm in a support group with a lot of women. And then I remember telling them when I went back to school, and I know at least 20 of them who have gone back to school on their own and done things that they never thought they would do or thought they could figure it out with a husband who worked away. But kind of being that community, and also just someone just telling you can do it. Like, we really underestimate how much that could be. So I feel like I tell every nurse that I work with, I'm like, you could be a doctor if you wanted to. Like, you could go back to school. We have lots of nurses. Tell my social workers, my OTPT, like everyone, I'm like, you could do this too. Like, as much as my story is busy, I mean, I went to school with an incredible woman who had 11 kids and 7 grandkids and 4 St. Bernards. And she's absolutely incredible. And so every time I'm like, you think I'm busy? That's because you haven't met Tina yet.
I love that. 11 kids. Okay. You see, and so like we do this all the time. We go 10 minutes over. Usually
Yes.
student questions come in after. So, you know, if anybody has any last minute questions, you would need to send it now because we're going to start to wrap up. I love that you started vibing with me when I did this. Like you just caught it. You caught the energy. I love it. I love it. You did miss a beat. So, you know, in that light that you were just describing, right, of you know, having an entirely different path. In your case, also a lot of negative experiences, but deciding that you want to, I'm paraphrasing, but it's a term that I use, turn pain into purpose, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like there were painful things that happened and then you transformed it into part of what drives you. What advice do you have for students, you know, young folks who are feeling uh, it in their heart or in their spirit that maybe healthcare is a pathway, and it might not be medicine, but healthcare, you know, in general, that they want to explore it, and you know, they might have doubts. But what is your advice to those folks?
You know what? If you want to do it, because the what ifs and the regrets will haunt you forever. And at least try. I mean, maybe you'll get into it and realize you actually can't stand the sight of blood. And then you realize that you never did it, but you'll never have that what if on if you could have done it, because chances are you can. And there's lots of incredible resources out there. And there's lots of incredible people across the country who are willing to help. I think about all of like the different STEM groups across the country that help either women or BIPOC folks to kind of realize that they have potential in STEM, and whether that's medicine or engineering or sciences. I mean, we don't always get that same encouragement. So if nobody's ever told you you can do it, you can. You can do it. I go to the high schools. I tell the kids all the time, I'm like, if you want it, you can have it. It might come with some work, and you might have to figure out what your strengths and weaknesses are, and kind of play into those. And there's a lot of different ways to get to the end point. And that's the beautiful thing about the forest, is that you could walk a different way and have a different kind of type of opportunity to kind of see what's happening. And you're beautiful. Sorry, I apologize. I'm in the hospital. If you can hear that.
That makes it real. This is real talk. You're in the
Patients
hospital.
are apparently running away. So that's just another day. But you can do it, and there's people out there willing to help, and it's okay to ask for help. And as much as you might not think people are willing, you just have to find the right person. And sometimes it takes a few people to figure out who that right person is, and it'll change your stars. So no matter what, keep going.
That's it. Like, just you need to explore it to know, right? Because as you said, you'll be haunted by, you know, the what if. So we do encourage you to please do explore it. You know, again, I do this every Tuesday just to kind of give you folks examples of folks who are doing it, and also making healthcare better, right? And so you are certainly healthcaring differently, Dr. Hernandez, but just improving healthcare and improving humanity. And so I thank you for that. And I hope folks are inspired by that. And if there's any resources or anything that you want to share, we're happy to share it in our newsletter and on our social media platforms. So let us know. We're also just happy to celebrate you. And we'll be, you know what I mean, sharing anything that you do as part of the health caring village. But yeah, we're now 15 minutes over. Again, that's tends to happen when we get the questions at the end. So I thank you for taking the time and the extra time. So thank you for joining us, Dr. Hernandez. And so y'all, next week, I'm going to have a medical student as my guest. And so it's going to be tea time with Hendrik Paquette Ambroise with the topic of medical school in Quebec. And the special episode is going to be in French. Alors, ça va être complètement en français. We don't usually do this. It's going to be our one French episode for the season, but si tu parles français, je vous invite. So if you speak French, we definitely want to have you join us. But for tonight, thank you for watching. Please follow us on social media. Sign up for our newsletter so you can get resources, and we'll see you next Tuesday at 7 p.m. for our French Health Caring Differently episode. Bonne nuit. Good night.